Hello and welcome to my weekly podcast, Through the Bible in 10 Years. Well, we've gone through all of the sermon of Hebrews, 13 chapters. Now, I can't prove to you it's a sermon, but it does in chapter 13 call itself a word of exhortation. That phrase is also used in Acts 13, where Paul and Barnabas are invited to give a word of exhortation. And so at least can be argued, and this is something that many scholars would agree with, that Hebrews is a homily or a short sermon with a letter conclusion on chapter 13. So it's a sent sermon. The author of Hebrews wrote Hebrews and then sent it to a congregation or group of congregations at a particular location, basically to be read in worship. Of course, I imagine that all the New Testament books were read in Christian worship, that this is most people were not able to read Greek at the time of Christ. And so I imagine that the way that all of the New Testament writings were disseminated were from what we would call the pulpit, although I doubt they had a pulpit per se. But basically, Hebrews would have then been a sent sermon, a sermon sent to a congregation at a distance. It's an emailed sermon, as it were. So, Hebrews, an introduction. Well, Hebrews is very ambiguous to us. It doesn't say, we sometimes talk about the riddles of Hebrews. Who wrote it? Who was it written to? When was it written? Why was it written? Where was it written from? Where was it written to? All of these questions are the stuff of commentary introductions. And when you read one commentary introduction, you often have read all of them because we just don't have any new information. And there are rarely any new angles even on the information. But in any case, I've waited to the end of Hebrews because we just don't know. And there was some desire to be a little bit inductive. I've tipped my hand at various things throughout. But okay, question number one. Who wrote it? A Hebrew scholar walks into a bar. Hey, who wrote Hebrews? Yeah, God knows. The answer, and the number one answer, in fact, the only answer we can really give to who wrote Hebrews is the answer that Origen gave around the year 200 AD. God knows. Origen thought that the thought was Paul's, but that the who wrote it was not Paul. Therefore, God knows. Now, of course, for millennia, let's say 1,800 years, 1,700 years, to say 1,800 years, it was the consensus of Christians that Paul wrote it, and for some people that's good enough. However, here we get into some debates. I don't want to get off on this. Maybe if my thoughts crystallize in a helpful way, one day I'll do it. But traditions are good at what our takeaway should be. I think that's the way I'd put it. Traditions are excellent at helping us know what we should take away from something. And the assignment of Paul as the author of Hebrews, the main takeaway, I would say, in the 300s and 400s was that this belongs in Scripture. What I don't think traditions are good about are the details of history. Traditions tend to preserve a kernel of truth that, like a fish story, gets kind of blown out of proportion. I often think of a story. I went to Florida. I grew up in Florida, and on one spring break, I took some friends from Asbury Seminary with me to Florida, and of course, my friends were quite happy to go with me to Florida because we went to the beach. By the way, as a Floridian, we hardly ever went to the beach. Growing up, I grew up 3 miles from the Fort Lauderdale beach, and the only time we went to the beach was when we had people visit from the north. Sometimes I ran there for track, but usually we didn't go to the beach unless we had visitors. So my friends from seminary came with me to Florida, and we went to the beach. Now, it does seem to me that at some point we might have talked to someone about Jesus. It seems to me, I do have a faint recollection that at some point while we were there, we did talk to someone about Jesus, and that was legitimately so. But if we were honest, did you go to Florida to witness to people on the beach, Ken? Well, that's not really why we went to Florida. Um, but it was interesting. Years later, I mean, over a decade later, um, someone told me about how inspired they were by the story of me and some others soul winning on the beaches of Florida, and I was like, "Come again? what? What's that?" I mean, I had to rack my brain to remember to remember that we'd even shared. Anyway, so I don't know what that says about me, but what I'm trying to illustrate is this. This is the way traditions work. Traditions go from less famous to more famous. They go from boring to more sensational. That fish was 3 inches. Oh well, it was 10 inches. Oh, that fish was 20 inches. Tradition is like that. I just don't think that's really contestable. Tradition tends to make things simpler and more basic, and because of that, they tend to preserve a core truth really well, but they don't do well, I don't think, of preserving the details. And so, yes, it's true that for some 1800 years, it was the general consensus of the church. Origen seems to settle the question. There was this debate before Origen. Did Paul write it? Did Paul not write it? Did Paul write it? Did Paul not write it? And Origen seems to have, by saying, well, the thought is Paul, even though God only knows who actually wrote it down, that seemed to have been enough for Hebrews to get into the canon, for it to get into the New Testament. And pretty much it took another couple hundred years for it to really become firmly consensus, I think. But pretty much then, for over 1,000 years, Christians just assumed that Paul had written Hebrews. Now, I know that for a lot of people, the kind of critical studies that arose in the 17 and 1800s are the boogeyman. But these studies, I believe, were more objective than tradition tends to be. The question becomes, what is the most likely interpretation of the evidence? Not how can I find a way to get the evidence to support what I already think, but what does the evidence seem to say? And if you're really interested in truth, that's the best approach, right? That's the way God thinks, right? God knows the evidence. The difference between us and God is God knows all the evidence, and he knows all the evidence in its proper relationship to all the other evidence, whereas we only know some of the evidence, and our minds are finite, and our minds are fallen. But for God, absolutely, the evidence demands a verdict. For God, the ontological argument for the existence of God perfectly works. The argument from necessity perfectly works in God's mind. It's not 100% clear whether those arguments work or not from a human perspective, because we're not God. But in theory, if we are objective and we are thinking clearly and we have enough evidence, that's going to lead us to what is true. And the pursuit of truth is a pursuit of objectivity, I would say, at least when it comes to historical, what is historically factual, or what is scientifically factual, and so forth. The things I'm saying are deeply controversial. But, of course, this is not supposed to be a video on philosophy or hermeneutics. It's supposed to be a video on the background of Hebrews. But I'm simply going to make the claim that the by far overwhelming majority of experts on Hebrews have said, now for a long, long time, is that Hebrews probably was not written by Paul, not directly. Now, I'm okay with Origen. Origen believes that I fully believe that Hebrews was written by somebody in the Pauline circle. I do see Hebrews as a kind of Paul 2.0, or I see Hebrews as the logical extension of Paul's thoughts. So I have no problem with the idea that Hebrews is a continuation of Pauline tradition, as it were, or a continuation of Pauline thinking, or that the author was in the Pauline school, even if you want to say. I have no problem with that at all. But I only know of one scholar in the last, let's see, let me do the math. In the last 70 years, I only know of one actual PhD in New Testament who has argued for Paul as the author of Hebrews. And that person is just fairly recent, who's argued for Paul as the author of Hebrews. Before that, I think it may have been the 1940s when some Roman Catholic scholars still argued for Paul as the author, and they kind of had to. I'm not saying they were insincere, but that was pre-Vatican II. If you were a Roman Catholic scholar, you kind of had to argue for tradition to keep your priesthood, I suppose. Maybe not, but the bottom line is that the style of Hebrews is not the style of Paul. Paul wrote in what we might call street Greek. Paul's Greek is colloquial, it's vernacular, it's some scholars have called it merchant Greek. It's not refined Greek. It's everyday speech. He uses ain't, so to speak, whereas Hebrews doesn't use ain't. Hebrews is, so and again, this is not a reflection on the truth of Paul's letters. I hope you don't hear me wrong there. But if an ancient Greek grammarian were to grade Paul and grade Hebrews and Luke would get an A. Paul would not get an A. I don't know what Paul would get, but he would not get an A if he turned in one of his letters to the gymnasium. Hebrews just has a different style, what was considered a better style, the periodic style. It's not Paul's style. This is not a knockdown, drag-out argument, but again, our question is what is most likely true, not whether it's possible for me to argue for what I want to argue. If I only argue for what I want to argue for, I'm not really interested in truth. Not really. I'm interested in preserving what I already think. If I'm interested in truth, I'm willing to change my mind, and I'm trying to be objective, and I'm trying to go with the evidence. I can't be perfectly objective, but I'm trying. And I believe that God's on the same page. If you could go to God and say, look, God, I'm sorry, but the evidence isn't there for you, God would say, fair enough. But of course, God knows that's not the case, right? God knows that the evidence demands the verdict that he is God. But I think God's on board with the method. I think God's on board with objectivity. And that God's on board with the pursuit for truth as a pursuit of the evidence. And again, we don't have the whole picture. We're going to fail. Faith is always involved. Again, I'm getting off in philosophy. But the style of Hebrews is not the style of Paul. The theology of Hebrews is not the theology of Paul. Now, I'm not saying it contradicts Paul. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying that Paul does not articulate that the sacrificial system is no longer necessary. I think that fits, that's a logical extension of things that Paul says, where he spiritualized the temple. Y'all are the temple of the Lord. But in Acts 21, Paul seems to offer a sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple. Now, he may have done it for practical reasons. He may have done it like, I don't need to do this because Jesus died for everything, but I'm going to do it to help these people out, because they don't understand. It's possible Paul was thinking something like that. But let me get down to brass tacks on theological distinctions. When Paul uses the word law, he is almost always, not always, but Paul is almost always talking about the Jewish particulars of the law. When Paul argues over the law in Galatians or Romans, he's talking about things primarily, things like circumcision, Sabbath observance, food laws, festivals. Those are the things that are the focal point of Paul's language on law. When Hebrews talks about law, particularly in chapter 7, it's primarily talking about the sacrificial system. Now, it's possible that Paul somewhere uses law in that way, but I can't think of any place. I can't think of any place in any of Paul's letters where when he says law, he means the sacrificial system. The sacrificial system just doesn't play very obviously in Paul's rhetoric. It wasn't an issue, apparently. And maybe I'm forgetting something. But basically, Hebrews uses law in a different way than Paul uses law. It doesn't contradict what Paul says, but I'm just basically saying that if you picked up Hebrews in the ancient world and you thought, this is interesting, I wonder who wrote it, you're probably not going to say Paul. Now, there are some things in chapter 13 that I will admit make you wonder. The things about Timothy's been out of prison, I'm going to come to you. But of course, if Paul were the author, you'd think he'd be in prison with Timothy, right? And so I much prefer someone in the Pauline circle. Barnabas, of course, has been suggested. Luke has been suggested. These are ancient suggestions. I'll get to that in a second. Probably the main reason that is given for Paul not being the author is that the author of Hebrews positions himself, and I do think it's a him. Let me go ahead and say that because that's not in any of my PowerPoints. There is what's called a participle. In English, we sometimes call these ing words. There's a participle in Hebrews 11:32, where the author of Hebrews says, "Time doesn't allow me to go on to tell you." And in Greek, when you going on to tell you, here the going, I'm kind of artificially making it an ing word, I think, but time does not allow me to go on. The word there, he has to assign a gender to who me is, and he picks masculine singular. Time does not allow me, masculine singular, going on to tell you. So the author self-identifies as a masculine singular. That means that we have to have a conspiracy of sorts if the author is not a man. And it doesn't work for a team writing it. Well, it's Priscilla and Aquila, because then it would be time does not allow us to go on and tell you. But it's me, it's singular. And also, you would have to say that the author is pretending to be Paul. And there is a scholar that argues that Hebrews is a pseudepigraphon. What is it? Claire Rothschild, I think, argues that Hebrews was written to pretend to be Paul. Again, I don't think there's anything like sufficient evidence trying to be objective. I'm not going, Ken, you're going with tradition. No, I don't think that there is sufficient evidence for such a hypothesis to be advanced. The author doesn't seem to be, the audience seems to know who the author is. The author says, I hope to come visit you. Well, the most natural way to read that is that they know who it is. And so I just, although, again, I'm not opposed to the idea that the author of Hebrews could be a woman. And Priscilla has often been suggested in recent times. I think it was, who was it that suggested that in the early 1900s? The name is failing me. But this, again, I'm interested in what's actually the case. And that just the evidence isn't there for the author being a female, in my opinion. But the author identifies himself in Hebrews 2:3 as a second-generation Christian. Verses 2 and 3 say, "How will we escape as we neglect such a great salvation which first began to be spoken by the Lord, having heard it from those who first witnessed it?" Now, the author does not identify himself as somebody who was an eyewitness of Jesus, but as somebody who learned from the eyewitnesses of Jesus. Well, you might say, well, Paul wasn't around Jesus, when Jesus was on earth. Yes, but Paul makes a very big point in Galatians and 1 Corinthians that he is an apostle who received his revelation from the Lord directly. 1 Corinthians 9:1, "Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord?" It would be very, very unusual for Paul to say, now I didn't receive anything from the Lord, but here's what I heard from James. Here's what Peter told me. That doesn't sound like Paul at all. In fact, in Galatians 1, what he says, I didn't receive this from a human. I received this from the Lord. Paul makes, in 1 Corinthians 15, "Lastly, I was born as of one time untimely out of season." So Paul identifies himself as an apostle. And so the positioning of the author of Hebrews is not that of Paul. None of this proves that Paul didn't wrote it. But that's not the question. The question is it possible that the question is not, is it possible that Paul wrote it? That's not the question that the truth seeker asks. The truth seeker asks, what is the most likely conclusion? And by far, the most likely conclusion is that Paul didn't write Hebrews. And similarly said, with the exception of one person, I don't know of any scholar since the 1940s that has argued for Paul as the author of Hebrews. Now, Luke has been suggested. There's just as there's a book out, Paul, the author of Hebrews, something like that. There's a book out, Luke, the author of Hebrews. I think maybe Ben Witherington thinks this. I'm not sure, but certainly stylistically, Luke, Acts, and Hebrews have more in common than any other books of the New Testament. That's true. So stylistically, I could see that. What dissuades me is that the theology and thinking of Hebrews does not seem to be that of Luke Acts. Again, I'm not saying it doesn't contradict Luke Acts. I'm just saying it's distinctive. It's different in a certain way. So the part of Luke Acts that is closest to Hebrews is Acts 7, when Stephen gives his speech before he's stoned. But the thing about Stephen's sermon in the book of Acts is it is unusual for Luke Acts. The theology of Hebrews with regard to the temple, he says, but God does not dwell in buildings made by hand. That is not the approach of Luke Acts in general. In fact, Luke Acts tends to be centered around Jerusalem and around the temple. Where does the Gospel of Luke begin? It begins in the temple with Zechariah. And of course, Jesus ascends from Jerusalem. By the way, in Matthew, it doesn't tell us about Jesus ascending from Jerusalem. The Gospel of Matthew ends in Galilee with the Great Commission, not in Jerusalem. So Luke begins and ends in Jerusalem. In fact, Luke doesn't even tell us about any of the resurrection appearances in Galilee. He omits it entirely. It's entirely in Jerusalem. And then, of course, the book of Acts begins in Jerusalem and then goes to the ends of the world. And so the theology of Acts 7 is not, it is, in fact, this is an argument for it being a somewhat accurate reflection of Stephen, is that the theology of Acts 7 is not the theology of Luke Acts in general. And as we know, as I said, Stephen's sermon is the closest thing in Acts to the book of Hebrews, and yet it's unusual for Luke. And in fact, I would argue that Luke may very well have Hebrews in mind, or Luke may have the author of Hebrews in mind as he portrays Stephen in chapter 7. Famous William Manson argued that Stephen was the beginning of the Hellenistic train that the author of Hebrews was in. I would say the opposite, that Stephen is depicted similarly to the author of Hebrews. So Luke has been suggested, but I don't think it's exactly his theology. Barnabas was suggested by Tertullian around the year 200. Now, Barnabas is a fine possibility. I mean, I can't disprove it. The thing about Barnabas is that, and here's where I'm going to go back to what I was saying about how traditions develop. You can play out a scenario where someone might say, man, who wrote Hebrews? Do you know who wrote Hebrews? Who wrote Hebrews? And you know, we do this, right? You pore over the text. You're looking for clues in Hebrews, clues on the New Testament. Who wrote this book? Well, what is Barnabas called? He's called the son of encouragement. And what is Hebrews called? Hebrews is called a word of encouragement. And so you could see Tertullian saying, I know who wrote Hebrews. It was Barnabas, because Barnabas is a son of encouragement and Hebrews is a word of encouragement. But of course, this is not a good argument. But this is how traditions develop, right? In fact, I have no problem with the idea that Luke wrote Luke Acts. But of course, the actual text of Luke Acts doesn't tell us who its author is. The heading wasn't written when Luke or whoever first wrote it. The heading was added some other time, when someone was collecting these writings, although there was some debate over that even. But, I mean, you could see how someone would say, man, who wrote Luke Acts? We know that they were sometimes traveling companion of Paul, because the we passages in the book of Acts. And we know that they're with Paul at the end of Acts. Well, let's see. What other books were written at the end of Acts? Oh, Colossians. Colossians and Philemon were written from Rome when Paul was in Rome at the end of Acts. And who was there? And you go through the names at the end of Colossians, and you go through the names at the end of Philemon, and you kind of do the process of elimination. You say Luke. Luke would be a great candidate for the author of Luke Acts, because, I mean, he's educated, he's a doctor. Luke Acts is really good Greek. Again, I'm not saying that Luke didn't write Luke Acts, but this is how traditions develop. Traditions are good about preserving the big picture, but traditions are horrible at preserving the details, I would argue. That's a different podcast for a different time on hermeneutics and historical study. But I'm not convinced that Barnabas is the best author. Martin Luther suggested Apollos. And if I had to pick, well, you didn't have your God knows is not one of the multiple choice answers. I have to pick a name. I have to fall off the log, as Bud Bent says. I would pick Apollos. Why? Because Apollos he fits the education marker. He fits the kind of philosophical and exegetical sophistication of Hebrews. And there are some parallels, I think, with with Philo in Alexandria. They're not deep parallels, but I've talked about them a little bit in chapters 8 through 10. There are some parallels with Alexandrian, even the way Scripture is quoted. There's a Scripture quoted in chapter 13. The only other place where it's quoted in exactly that way is in Philo's writings. Apollos grew up at Alexandria, would have probably been part of the synagogue where Philo was, maybe even gone to Sunday school. Excuse me. And so, if I have to pick, I'd pick Apollos. He seems to fit the bill, but I can't prove it. He's in this Pauline circle. He would know Timothy, for example. He was at Ephesus. Timothy was at Ephesus at some point. So I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it at that. The best answer is, of course, though, that only God knows. Hebrews is anonymous, and we just don't know. And unless there's some major archaeological discovery, we won't know any more than we know right now. Every introduction, well, not every introduction, but most commentary introductions go over the same evidence over and over and over again. I don't think it's the Virgin Mary, by the way. There was a Catholic woman who had a vision from the Virgin Mary saying that she'd written it. I respectfully disagree. All right, so where was it written from and where was it written to? Well, again, we don't know. Probably the most commonly suggested destination for Hebrews is Rome. It's not a knockdown fallout or knockdown drag out kind of argument. It's not the vast majority that believe that, but I think there is a plurality that are sympathetic to that. So I'm going to word it weakly. And probably it's a very weak basis, but I would say there are a couple of reasons. One is that the history of the congregation seems to match the history of Rome. So we hear about a couple persecutions. They had their property confiscated. Maybe some of their leaders have died. And so the problem is that we know more about the history of the Roman Church probably than we know about most other churches. So it's quite possible that this happened all the time everywhere. It's just that we know certain incidents in Rome. We know that in the year 49, Claudius kicked the Jewish Christians out of Rome, which probably would have involved a loss of property. We know that Nero put Christians to death. Nero put Peter and Paul to death in the 60s. And so we know of past persecutions at Rome, and so it's easy to say, that's what's going on here. It doesn't prove it, of course, because the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. It's an argument from silence. It may very well be that the Church of Berea had exactly the same experiences. We don't know. But Rome is often suggested. And there's this little comment in chapter 13, those from Italy greet you. And so what does that mean? Does it mean, we've got some Italians here that greet you, and the audience is in Corinth? I don't know. Montefiore and Luke Timothy Johnson, I believe, have suggested, well, this is a cipher for Priscilla and Aquila. So you could say to the people at Corinth, those from Italy greet you, and they know who you were talking about. But to me, even though it's not a proof, it's not foolproof. That is, the most likely way to read this is there are some people with me here, wherever I'm at, who are from Italy. And they are greeting you. And this it could include Priscilla and Aquila, but maybe more than Priscilla and Aquila. I don't think the author would say, I'm here in Italy, and those from Italy here greet you. He could say that, but Italy's a big place. Why not say those from Rome greet you, or those from Puteoli greet you? Those from Italy, is he writing from the whole Italian church? And the preposition is apo, which tends to mean away from. It's not a strong lexical argument because it's more flexible than that. But away from Italy, I think, is the starting point for reading it. It's not a proof, but a suggestion that the author is somewhere away from Rome, writing to Rome. Jerusalem used to be the tradition. The thought was, the author's trying to convince some Jews not to rely on the temple. Well, the people who are in the temple are in Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem was the kind of the go-to destination for that same period of time that Paul was thought to be the author. But there aren't that many. I do know of at least one scholar who I think is sympathetic to it being Jerusalem. I mentioned Hugh Montefiore and Luke Timothy Johnson have suggested Corinth, although I don't think they're willing to die for it. So it would be someone from the Pauline circle. Well, they would both, I think, be sympathetic to Apollos. maybe especially Montefiore, someone like Apollos writing to Corinth, writing back to Corinth. Um, so that's been suggested. I think Ephesus is as good a suggestion as any. Again, this is not a strong argument at all, but Timothy is mentioned. We know that Ephesus was a major church center, and we know that Timothy was at Ephesus. And so the idea that Timothy might have been arrested at Ephesus and that he is writing the Roman church, that works. Of course, I date it to after Paul's death, and so Timothy possibly would have already been to Rome and others to visit Paul while he was under house arrest there. It's possible. So if I had to pick, I would pick Apollos from Ephesus writing to Rome, but I can't prove it, and my confidence level goes down with each one. Written to Rome is probably the one of those three that I would be most confident of. Then maybe Apollos as a second guess for author, and then Corinth as a weak guess. Ephesus as a weak guess for where it's written from. Again, can't prove it, not going to die for it. Who is it written to? Now here, I'm not talking about location. Here I mean the nature of the audience. Is the audience Jewish, or is the audience non-Jewish? Is the audience Gentile? Now, for years, and this tells you a little bit about my past, and perhaps a little bit of why, at least my personal philosophy is go with the facts, go with the evidence, try to be objective. Don't let your feelings interfere with your thinking. I realize it's a very Western way of going, but it's worked well for science. And for many things, I think it's the best approach we can have if we're really interested in truth. A lot of debatable things I'm saying philosophically, aren't there? But for years, I thought, well, of course it's a Jewish audience. Good grief. Who would suggest a Gentile audience? I had my PhD, and I thought that, of course the audience is Jewish. But often when I think things are obvious, I often realize that I'm blind to something or some things as I look at it into more detail. Now, sometimes I think things are obvious after I've looked into them in detail. That's different, I think. But often I've, like with this, I thought, well, of course the audience is Jewish. But I would say that the suggestion of a Jewish audience or certainty about a Jewish audience is usually based on certain false assumptions. For example, well, Gentiles wouldn't be interested in using the temple. Of course, Gentiles wouldn't want to use the temple. And look at how much scripture the book of Hebrews uses. Gentiles wouldn't know about the scriptures like that. Obviously, the audience is Jewish. Both of these suggestions blow away like a puff of wind. They have no substance to them whatsoever. In fact, we know that if someone is a convert to Christianity out of the blue, let's say that they were a hardcore bad person, and the Lord saves them and they come to Christ, what is that person usually like? Well, they pore over the scriptures. They stay up late at night. Man, this is good stuff. They just eat it up. Tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. They pray. Whereas somebody who grew up in the church, they might be pretty comfortable with their faith. Yeah, I believe in all the Bible. Yeah, I read the Bible once. It's actually more likely, I would say, that a convert to Christianity is going to be more zealous and more on fire than the person who, well, I've just been a Christian my whole life. And so when we think about the early church, sure, there were Jews who'd grown up, they'd gone to synagogue every week, yeah, I'm a Jew. In fact, we see this at Alexandria. If you know a little bit about Philo's family in Alexandria, a Jewish family in Alexandria, they're pretty lukewarm about some of the particulars, at least some of his family. In fact, he has a nephew that renounces his faith and becomes a Roman general and governor. So I think he was a general as well. But those who are converts to Christianity, they would have been eating it up. Oh, I need more scripture. I need me some more Genesis. I need me some more Isaiah. I need me some more Psalms. We can suggest that those who converted to Judaism from non-Judaism, or those who converted to Jewish Christianity from non-Jewish from Gentile land, were probably more zealous about their newfound faith than a lot of Jews who, yeah, I go to synagogue, yeah, we do the Seder. And so, is it possible that there would have been Gentile converts to Christianity who would have been able to follow the scriptural argument of Hebrews? Absolutely. Absolutely. They would have dug into the scriptures when they believed on Jesus. I mean, they were changing gods. I mean, if you're switching from, I'm no longer believing in Zeus, I'm believing in Yahweh, I don't think it's not easy for us to know the magnitude of that kind of a switch. These Gentile converts would have been incredibly zealous, I think, some of them at least. And of course, just because anybody can write a book that others don't understand. So the fact that Hebrews has a complex argument doesn't mean that the audience understood it either. I mean, that's the other side of this. And so the idea that Gentiles wouldn't be interested in the temple, this is another thing. Hebrews is really the most definitive work that says the Old Testament sacrificial system is no longer needed. Paul never says the Old Testament sacrificial system is no longer needed. The Gospels don't say the Old Testament sacrificial is no longer needed, although John, which I think comes after Hebrews, may intimate that. Even Luke Acts, as I mentioned, has we get no impression from Luke Acts that the temple is no longer needed. I believe it would have taken a little bit of time for the early Christians to fully sink in that Jesus was a replacement for the temple. We think, well, of course, that's obvious. Well, we have the book of Hebrews. And so I believe that there would have been Gentiles. And here's another thing. Christianity was not a separate religion from Judaism. The Gentiles who converted to Christianity saw themselves as converting to Judaism. They were converting to the true Judaism, the Judaism that believed that Jesus was the Messiah. But they were not converting to some Gentile religion. They were not converting to some third religion. Long after the earliest apostles were gone, Christianity remained a form of Judaism. There's a whole rich literature arguing about when the parting of the ways actually happened. My mentor argued that it started to happen definitively after Jerusalem was destroyed. But I think we can say with fair certainty that before 70 AD, before the temple was destroyed, there were no Christians who did not see themselves as converts to Judaism. And the Gentile believers in Jesus saw themselves as true Jews, Gentile Jews, but as part of true Israel. Paul says that a Gentile who keeps the law, a Gentile who is not a Jew by nature, but keeps the heart of the law, has a circumcised heart. They're part of true Israel. And so this idea that that a Gentile would not have been invested in the temple or would not have been invested in the scriptures, it's just not true to the actual historical situation. They would have been invested in the temple, I believe. They would have been troubled by the temple's destruction. They would have been deeply troubled by Jerusalem's destruction. So basically, the idea, well, the author is obviously Jewish, it actually doesn't hold any water at all. Then, do we have any reason to think that they could have, is there any evidence for them being Gentiles? Well, a long time ago, David de Silva's commentary on Hebrews, especially what he says around 5:11 through 6:12, I think it is, especially verses 5:12 and verses 6:1 and 2. And of course, he thinks the audience is primarily Jewish, although mixed. But again, for a long time, I thought, well, obviously the audience isn't Gentile. But as I looked at these verses say, let's not go back to the things that you first learned when you became a Christian. And then he goes on in 6:1 and 2 to talk about things that every Jew already believed, faith in God, for example, and so forth. Repentance from sinful works. These are things that every Jew learned from the beginning. They are not things that a Jew would have learned when they became a Christian. And so these verses, again, if you say, okay, so what is the most likely audience for these verses? It's a Gentile audience to Christianity, because a Gentile convert to Christianity would have learned about faith in God when they became a Christian. They would have learned about repentance from sinful works when they became a Christian. And so that little pointed bit at the audience, I think, makes it more likely that the audience is primarily Gentile. I'm not saying there weren't any Jews in the audience. I'm saying that it was primarily a Gentile audience. And this fits the Roman Church because the Roman Church, first of all, the Jewish Christians had to leave Rome around the year 49. And as I read the book of Romans is overwhelmingly addressed toward Gentiles. And that's what Paul says in the beginning. Chapter 16, I think, of Romans has clouded the minds of many scholars, but that's for another day when we get to Romans. But I think, in general, Romans was written, the book of Romans was overwhelmingly written to a Gentile audience. Again, not that there weren't Jews there, but I think it was overwhelmingly written probably to a Gentile audience. And so it fits that the church at Rome would be primarily Gentile. I'm not saying entirely Gentile, I'm just saying primarily Gentile. And of course, Hebrews talks about turning away from the living God. Well, a Jew who gave up on Christ, you could argue that they're turning away from the living God. They're not, in their mind, turning away from Yahweh. So this is not a knockdown, drag-out argument. But if you're a Gentile turning away from Christianity, you are turning away from Yahweh. If you're a Gentile turning away from Jewish Christian faith, you are leaving the living God. So this statement, although it's not an absolute proof, this statement would have the most meaning if the audience was Gentile. Because if the audience turns away from their Jewish faith, their Jewish Christian faith, they would be turning away from the living God and going back to the dead gods of the idols that they worshipped before. So I cannot prove it, but if I have to fall off the log, I fall off the log that the audience of Hebrews is primarily a Gentile audience. And as I said, the Roman church was primarily Gentile. So when was Hebrews written? Well, it's often thought that Hebrews is arguing against using the temple. But if you read it carefully, it never says that. It never says stop using the temple. And if Hebrews was written before the temple was destroyed, then I think that has to be the subtext. If Hebrews is written before the temple is destroyed, the subtext is stop using the temple. Jesus took care of it. It becomes what's called a polemic. It becomes a pretty controversial argument against the temple. Don't trust the temple. You don't need the temple. Don't use the temple. That's not the tone of Hebrews. The tone of Hebrews is much more, you don't need the tabernacle. We have a better country than Israel. We have a better city than Jerusalem. We have a better priest and a better sanctuary and a better sacrifice. And so I have argued that the book of Hebrews may have been written, again, I can't prove it, but it may have been written not long in the aftermath of Jerusalem and the temple's destruction, where some Christians were like, is this thing even true? And you think especially of Gentile Christians, is this thing even true? What God lets their own city be destroyed? What God lets their own temple be destroyed and defiled? You can see where this would be a struggle of faith for some both Jewish and Gentile Christians, but especially for Gentile Christians, because the whole Jewish faith is at stake. And so in that light, Hebrews is kind of like, why are you worrying about the fact that the temple's not destroyed? The temple never took away sins in the first place. There was always a heavenly tabernacle that was the real tabernacle. The earthly tabernacle, it was always an illustration. It was always a sketch. It was never the temple itself. And so the fact that there's no temple on earth, it doesn't matter, because the real temple's in heaven. No more earthly sacrifices. Why does it? You shouldn't worry about this. The blood of bulls and goats never took away sins. Jesus was always what these things were foreshadowing. They were always looking forward to Jesus. And Jesus didn't do it on earth. I mean, he wouldn't be a priest if he were on earth. But Jesus has entered into heaven itself. And through an eternal spirit has offered a sacrifice. And it's a once and for all eternal sacrifice. Those earthly sacrifices, they had to be offered over and over again by earthly priests who died over and over again. And it wasn't permanent. This is an eternal priesthood. This is an indestructible life. And so why are you worrying about the fact that the temple is destroyed? Because Jesus was always the reality toward which it pointed. And now that Jesus has died and offered himself to God, there is no need for sacrifice. So we don't have to worry about the fact that there's no temple. And don't worry about Jerusalem being destroyed. Don't worry about the fact that the homeland in Israel has been destroyed by the Romans. Because remember the people in Hebrews 11, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, They were aliens and strangers in the land. They were looking for a better homeland. They were looking for a better city. They could have returned to their earthly origins if they'd have wanted to, but they were seeking a heavenly homeland, a city that God had prepared, a city that was built by God and not made by human hands. So we have here no city that remains, Hebrews 13 says. All of this, again, if it were written in the aftermath of the temple's destruction, all these words become incredibly powerful and poignant. Don't worry about the fact that the destruction of Jerusalem has happened, because God is going to soon shake the whole created world. This whole created world, as Haggai says, yet once more I will shake both the skies and the earth. And Hebrews says when there's a shaking of this, it's a removal of them, that the unshakable kingdom may remain. So yes, it may look like the Romans have had their day at the moment. Yes, Titus may have marched the intelligentsia and the elite and the Sadducees and the priests and all these important people. Titus may have marched them through the streets of Rome and put them all to death. But people die for their faith. Remember in Hebrews 11, some people, God did rescue some, but others chose to die, choosing a better resurrection. And you've not died yet. You're worried, oh, it's going to get bad for me. But you've not yet resisted to the point of blood. Remember your leaders who shared with you the way of life. Consider the outcome of their life and then imitate it, which could be a reference to Peter and Paul. In general, I really believe that Hebrews has a post-Pauline feel. So, for example, Jew and Gentile this is not a debate. In Hebrews. Hebrews never, the tension that Paul is always working with in his writings between the law and Jew and Gentile integration. The book of Hebrews doesn't worry about Jew-Gentile integration. So it has a sense of that it's like it's Star Trek: The Next Generation. We're not worrying about the Klingons anymore. Now we have Klingons on the Enterprise. I didn't watch Next Generation, so I'm sorry if I butchered that. But Hebrews feels post-Pauline. Not too far, because Timothy's still alive. But within 10 years, in less than 10 years after Paul, I would date the book of Hebrews, maybe in the year 71 or even 70, or possibly 72. So I would say early 70s for my dating of the book of Hebrews. So why was it written? Well, it was urged to keep on swimming, buck up, little camper, keep going. Just keep swimming, I mean, chapter 11, if you read chapter 11 in the light of its context, it's not just some nice little eulogy on all these great people from the Old Testament. Everything that Hebrews 11 says, as you can see if you read my explanatory notes or see the video on Hebrews 11, everything in Hebrews 11 is directly relevant to the audience. And it has to do with believing in the unseen and keeping going and enduring persecution and not paying attention to the edict of the king, which would have overtones of the Roman emperor. Moses ignored the edict of the king. Keep going. The warning passages. Chapter 3, don't be like the Israelites whose corpses fell in the desert because of unbelief. Keep going to the end. Chapter 2, we must not let these things slip. We have to keep going. Chapter 6, it is impossible for them, if they fall away, to renew themselves to repentance. Chapter 10, if we continue to sin willfully in disbelief, after we received a knowledge of the truth, there remains no more sacrifice for sins. Chapter 12, don't be like Esau, who sold his birthright for a little food. And there does seem to be something going on in the synagogue I'll mention in a second. But all of these are basically saying, you guys need to keep going. You're experiencing the training, the discipline of the Lord. Hebrews 12, you need to keep going. They fear persecution again. He says, hey, you haven't died yet, have you? Yeah, no. What are you worrying about? Keep going. Again, chapter 11 has all of these images of persecution by the emperor and so forth. Moses, he didn't care. He chose rather to suffer with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, which would have been very meaningful to Roman. If there were Roman citizens in the audience, it's like, wow, I can really get out of a lot of stuff because I'm a Roman citizen and I'm a Gentile. But don't be like that. Be like Moses, who was willing to suffer with the Jews, who was willing to suffer with the people of God. Be like that. And again, chapter 10 and 6 talk about how, remember what you did before your property was confiscated. You were model Christians. Do it again. In chapter 11, endure the discipline of the Lord. So keep going. Don't fear persecution. They are worried about atonement. I mean, I don't think we can say Hebrews 8 through 10 are even 7 through 10 are the core of Hebrews. And it's all about how Christ is the superior atonement. That just has to have something to do with their wavering in faith. Part of their worrying about faith has to have to do with the temple. And I don't buy that it's just the strange teachings in the temple, or in the synagogue, that's what's going on. Chapter 13 talks about don't pursue these false teachings. Apparently there's some synagogue meal of some kind that it's like, hey, if you guys don't eat this synagogue meal, you can't get atonement, and you can't eat with us unless you give up this Christian stuff that you're doing, or something along those lines. And by the way, that's more of a later first century kind of thing anyway. We don't have a lot of evidence of I won't say that. So I don't think that's the major thing behind Hebrews, though, the strange teachings thing in chapter 13. It must have something to do with the temple, surely. This, even though it's the tabernacle, which, by the way, I think it makes sense to make a theoretical argument about the tabernacle from Exodus after the temple's destroyed. That makes a lot of sense. We're going to step back and talk theoretically about the sanctuary here. We're not going to talk about the Jerusalem temple. We're going to talk theoretically here. And so they are worried about atonement. And I wonder if it's because the temple's been destroyed. What would make them fear persecution, be in danger of not keeping going, and connect it to it, their need for atonement, and there being a rise of strange teachings about atonement in the synagogue related to synagogue meals? All of that fits a post-destruction context to me. It's like, how am I going to have atonement? Is this Christianity even true? What God would let their city and temple be destroyed? And Hebrews says, oh, come on. The temple was never meant to take away sins. It was always Jesus. And so the sermon of Hebrews encourages them to keep going. That's the exhortation. Just keep swimming. Just keep swimming. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Run with patience the race that is set before you. Jesus is at the finish line. And all these other heroes of faith, they've done it. You finish too. Keep going, keep going, keep going. That's the exhortation part. And the exposition then removes the obstacle to faith. What is causing them to worry about their faith? They're worried about, the temple's destroyed. And Hebrews like, you're worried about the temple? Jesus was always the way that God meant to take away sins. Earthly animal sacrifices never have taken away sins. That earthly temple was just a copy, it was just a shadowy illustration of the true temple up in heaven. And that's all the created realm that God's going to remove and transform anyway. And so we need to trust in Jesus and look to Jesus, and let us enter with boldness into the before the throne of grace and ask for grace to help in time of need. Jesus was tempted to give up too, but he didn't. And therefore, we have a high priest who's sympathetic, a sympathetic high priest, a merciful and gracious high priest, and one who is tempted like we are, but he didn't sin. And so, there is my sense of the situation of Hebrews. I may be wrong on many points. I look forward to being corrected when we get to heaven. This has been Through the Bible in 10 years.